Hey, welcome everyone. We're glad to be back again in September to have Liz Casteel back with us to walk us through the challenges of the day. The title of our conversation today is Challenges of the Crisis, Now What? You may remember the last time we were on talking to Liz, it was back in April. And I don't even know back then if we anticipated still being social distancing at home come September, but that's where we find ourselves today. So we're thankful to have Liz back, and I'd like to start by having Liz reintroduce herself and tell us a little bit about her and the practice she has at Nikeo Counseling. Liz?
Hey there, guys. It is good to be back. So my name's Liz Casteel. I'm the director of Nikeo Counseling Center, which is in North Dallas, and we've got a team of 10 counselors, and we all work with different issues. Although in the midst of the pandemic, all 10 of us are working a lot with helping individuals and families and marriages be more resilient through this unpredictable season. And so we actually had a team meeting last week for a couple of hours, just talking through what are we seeing in our office, what are we experiencing in our own personal lives. We all live different kinds of lives. Some are single, some are married, some have younger kids, some have high school and college age kids on our counseling staff. And so it's just talking through what has this been like for us personally, and then what are we seeing in our office. So I hope today, when I just spent some time talking with you, Henry, and I know we've got some listeners, that some things will really resonate of how could our time together be helpful, be encouraging, hopefully give you some tools to move forward in resiliency.
Yeah, good. That's a great introduction. Thank you. Yeah, this really is a challenge. And when we were together back in April, the school year was winding down. And so we were coaching parents. How do you do this school from home and assisting your kids? Then summer comes upon us and school's behind us. But here we are in September and school is starting up again. So Liz, how would you coach families that maybe have had a rough start to the school year? What would you say to them as they get ready? Again, not knowing how long this is going to go on, but this is kind of where they find themselves, and even schools, they're doing a variety of different things. So some schools are back, some schools are having a mix between being back and being home. But what would you say to the parent that as they look at where we are now on September 11th, we've kind of had a misfire or a rough start to the school year?
And I do think in many ways it's been a rough start. I think even, there are private schools that the students are back now. And then in public schools, sometime in the next couple of weeks, I think students will start going back. But it's the not knowing what this is going to look like. And I think the first step with this, if it's been a rough start, is for each family or each marriage to look at why it's been rough. Because if you can't change something that you can't identify. And this is going to be different for different families. So even when our counselors met last week, and some of our counselors are having a rough start too. We're not immune to anything, but it was identifying. It was really neat as a team to just talk through that. What's been rough? And we have, some of our counselors that kids are in private schools. And so, they're back in a routine, and the students are still home. And then the parents, if they have a job, outside of being a full-time parent, they're trying to figure out, how to make that work. So I think some of this is really identifying what's made it rough. There's a lot of new protocols in place. There's new protocols even if your kids aren't yet back in school, but it's trying to stay in compliance, battling wearing masks or not wearing masks. And if you have kids that are more willing to wear masks than those that aren't, it's trying to figure out going through that. And one of the things that I'm a real fan of is having kind of a family meeting, and maybe you even call it like a do-over. Like if it's just been a rough start, we need to push a reset button as a family, and seeing if the family would sit down together. And I think you can do this with young kids too, that are 6, 8, 10 years old, and certainly kids that are 14, 16, and 18 years old, and say, hey, can we just sit down and talk through, this has been a bumpy ride, and where did it go wrong in the midst of the pandemic? So, the pandemic is like the catalyst for why this has gotten a rough start, that I do think every family brings in its own dynamics. And I think the big thing, if a reset button needs to be pushed, is, and it probably will start with parents, could they identify perhaps how they've contributed to it being a bumpy start? And that's not to blame. It's just to explain and take ownership for that. Hey, here's how I think I contributed. Maybe a parent's picked a lot of the battles, and some of those battles needed to be released. Like a parent that was trying to just maintain control of everything, which really we just can't maintain control of everything. Again, I'm a fan of using a 1 to 10 scale. So put these things on 1 to 10. The things that are 8, 9s, and 10s, which are super important to address and hold to fast. And then there's going to be things that are 1, 2s, and 3s that you're like, oh yeah, hey, I wish my teenager would do this, but they're not willing to do that, and I need to let that go. So it's some of those things can create a rough start. But I do this a lot in my office when I meet with families. Is could we all meet together, and is there at least one person that's willing to start out saying, okay, this has been my part in it? And if parents can model that first, maybe kids, even an 8-year-old, and this isn't, again, to blame or to make kids feel bad, but it's to say, hey, we're all struggling here. And let's identify why we're struggling. Let's go ahead and just identify this has been a rough start. And then what can each of us do that might kind of help us push a reset button here? Sometimes I'm studying the Israelites, actually, the Old Testament Israelites, and imagine them. And they literally were living in tents. I mean, sometimes large tents. But I'm telling you, they struggled too. And there was conflict there. And they were in close quarters with their family members and extended family members. And we know that they were complainers and they groaned a lot. But God was faithful in the midst of this. And so I think that's kind of the first step, is just taking ownership for why it's been a rough start, and then moving forward with that.
Liz, I love that answer, and I love the thought of the do-over. In fact, I tell people in all sincerity that Monday is my favorite day of the week, because if I had a great week last week, I get to build on it as I start a new week. But if last week was a difficult week, Monday is that's my do-over reminder that I get to start again. So I love the Monday thought. The other thing you said that I really liked was asking what can each of us do, or my part in it is. And I just love the humility of that thought, that, hey, we've had a rough start to the year. Here's some things that I think are my part in this. I think when parents can lead with that, that's so, what a great model and example for kids, when we recognize that, hey, I'm part of the problem too. In fact, here's my part in that. So I love that answer to that, is you have this thing called a do-over, whether it's the school year or other questions that we'll get to later. But I'd love to see that theme kind of permeate our thinking, is on the do-over, because this is a difficult time we're navigating, but recognizing that I do have the opportunity to start again, a little bit wiser now. So I thank you for that first answer.
And I would say too,
yeah, go ahead.
The reality too is that families sometimes can't do that on their own. There's just a pretty strong current that's been there for a long time, even before the pandemic. And so they're just struggling with that. And so sometimes that's where I'm like, whether it's a counselor, whether it's a good friend, whether it's a chaplain, it's like getting that third person in that can just help communication. I met with a family yesterday that honestly, I didn't do a whole lot except for just provide a safe place. There were 5 in the family that they came in and were just able to communicate through their conflict. So it's just owning that. It's just universal. Families are struggling.
Yeah, and all of us make mistakes, and that's what I like about what your part in it, because the sometimes we're more tempted to say, hey, let me tell you what your part in is in it, but it's much a better choice to take a look at what my own part in is in it, and then that helps people recognize that, hey, well, thanks for saying that. This was the role I think I played as well. So I love that first answer. That's pretty powerful. Well, what about,
Yeah.
so when we talked back in April, we had COVID, and that was a big thing, a pandemic. Kids probably didn't even know what a pandemic was. I don't think any one of us knew what this could mean or what this is going to look like in the coming months. But then on top of that, we've had unrest across the country as well. So what would you tell the parents? How do we help our kids manage potential fear? Because if they're exposed to social media or TV and they see some of the things that you can see on TV, there could be a level of fear that the kids might have. So how would you help the parents help their kids manage that fear when you look at a pandemic and unrest?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer this in two ways. So when I know that I was going to be talking to you this morning, over the last couple of weeks, just have done some kind of impromptu interviews with kids between the age of 6 all the way up through college. Okay. So I've just talked, sometimes they were 2-minute conversations, sometimes they were 20-minute conversations. I have 5 nieces that were all a part of this. I just wanted to know kind of where are kids in this? So I'm going to answer it 2 ways. So the first way, what I found, and this was actually even a part of our conversation with my counseling team last week, is that what we're seeing is that kids aren't necessarily struggling with a lot of fear right now. And I'm not saying 100% of the kids, but I am saying that about 90% of the kids that I talk to and that our counseling team has been talking to are not waking up and aware of kind of this constant fear of, oh my gosh, am I going to get sick? Or, will my grandparents, get COVID and end up dying? It's a little bit off of their radar. It wasn't back when we talked in April, but there's this shift now, and some of it is people kind of just being tired of it and maybe compartmentalizing it. But I had a conversation with a couple of kids yesterday. One was 14, one was 16, and they were like, we're not afraid at all. One is being homeschooled, one is actually back in school. And it was this, it just kind of is. One of our counselors was telling me last week that her kiddo went back to school, who's 8 years old. And in the school where they are, around the desks, they have put these kind of Pyrex, these plastic shields around each desk. I mean, amazing. These schools were able to make this happen so quickly. But you know what her kiddo said? He said, oh, this is cool. I have my own cubicle now. And he was just in the best mood and came home that night, was talking about, he felt like he had his own little cubicle in his own office. And so again, that's a younger child that is wearing the mask all day. These kids are wearing masks all day. And there's not a lot of that fear going on. So with that being said, I wanted to give a couple of statistics. This is out of NYU, New York University, the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, is that 66% of parents have said that they feel only slightly or moderately inconvenienced by this. Okay, so, and this was just done 4 weeks ago. 26% of parents are saying this is extremely inconvenient for us. And I think kids are going to pick up on that too, is what is the feel around the home? Also around fear. Are parents sharing, and again, parents are going to have more just kind of a view of this that's probably more accurate, especially if parents have, compromised immune systems or have their own parents, their aging parents, or they can see this more clearly. Children typically, and especially adolescents, and I'm not calling them narcissists, I'm just saying go through a real kind of narcissistic stage of, I don't want to be inconvenienced. I don't want to wear a mask. I'm not afraid of this. This is just some stupid stuff. I mean, that's stuff that we hear too, of kids that just, they don't want their life to be inconvenienced and they want to keep going and doing the same thing. But so I want you to know that that's more of what we're seeing. More than kids being afraid of what's going on, they're just inconvenienced by it and wanting to move through it. And then we've got parents at home that are like, oh gosh, and especially if there's been, financial consequences or someone's been furloughed or lost a job, that they're experiencing the stress of this more than kids. So what I want to say in light of this is for parents to look and say, wait a minute, okay, where am I at in this? Where's my fear level, my anxiety level? How justified is it? Or in some ways, am I overreacting? Or do I have a really good feel for it? And I'm aware of where and maybe even use a 1 to 10 scale. And by the way, spouses may be in different places. I see this a lot with my married friends, with folks that come into our counseling office. Is I use a 1 to 10 scale. Well, how anxious or fearful are you? And maybe the wife is like, man, I'm at an 8. But it also may be because she's the one more responsible. And research is showing that the moms are 77% more likely to be doing the homeschooling and kind of carrying the everyday functions of the family. And again, that's a statistic that just came out 4 weeks ago. So she may say, man, I'm at an 8. Like, this is really hard for me. And the husband may say, I'm at a 2. And again, it's because his role looks really different. But then you want to look over and have the parent look at and say, well, where are our kids realistically? And again, they may have a kiddo that is at an 8. And again, maybe that's because the kiddo's been exposed to a lot, or just hears the news, or hears the parents talking, or maybe the kiddo kind of before the pandemic already had some heightened anxiety. And we see that too. So if we were seeing a 10 or 12-year-old in our office that was already struggling with anxiety and fear, and then the pandemic comes along, they're already going to move into kind of a higher level of fear. But again, I'm going to go back to using some kind of self-examination, starting with the parent, of how am I handling this? And is that helping or hurting my kids? And is that causing them to feel more anxiety or fear? Or am I actually keeping this in perspective, showing resilience as best as I can, which would, by the way, if a kiddo was at an 8 or a 7 on that scale, but a parent is really modeling resilience and not showing fear and anxiety, that can take that number down very quickly for the kiddo. And it can have a big influence on them. But with that, I do want to say it is super important to monitor screen time, what kids are seeing and doing. That's huge. There was a statistic that came out that says 33% of families are reporting that actually the parent-child relationships have improved. So it's 33%. Obviously, it's not the majority, but there is some hope in that. I find that a heartening, positive statistic, and hopefully that can continue to improve. And I think as that improves, we can find that the fear and anxiety that kids are feeling, if they're feeling it, will start to dissipate as well.
Yeah, that's really good. I like the modeling word, because a parent doesn't necessarily have to say, hey, I'm fearful or I'm angry. But if you carry yourself that way, your kids can see things that you're not verbally communicating, but you're communicating nevertheless. And so I like that idea about modeling in front of your kids. I think that's really significant. I was encouraged to hear, though, that the parent-child relationship is improving for some, and that's one of the things I'm hopeful for. I hope that we can look back on these days in the midst of the challenges with the unrest, the finances, the homeschooling. I hope there's some good things that can come out of this, and with that being stronger relationships. I'm even noticing that from a workplace perspective. When you get together with people that you work with while you're doing this working from home, you realize just how valuable we are to each other and how important these relationships are, that I may not have appreciated it as much when I see them every day, but now that we don't see them, we get excited when we do. And so I'm hoping some good things can come out of it. And I like that thought about better family relationships. So I think that's good. What about, and I know that you probably have marriages that are, boy, I love having you at home. This is while you're doing your work, or the spouse is doing their work. There's some neat things that are coming out of that. But what would you say to the families that maybe the marriages have been taxed? And I'd like your thought on I think you said 77% of the wives are the ones that are doing the helping with the education part, where the mom and dad could be at different places with their concerns
Yeah.
with this. And so maybe there's some marriages that feel taxed where, well, I can't wait to get back to work just to get out of the house. What would you say to that couple that feel like, hey, this has been a strain on these past 5, 6 months have been a strain on my marriage?
And I would say, again, that's a lot of the marriages. It's just hard. You know, you've got, if both spouses are working and then they're trying to manage kids and homeschooling, or if one spouse is working outside of the home, well, now in the home, but maybe in a study and just needing to stay separate. But it's just a lot. And I honestly don't see a real difference between, oh, well, you know, the husband who's working a full-time job is more stressed than, say, the wife who is the full-time mom but now has had to become a quote-unquote school teacher. Like, it's just been so stressful. I think some of the signs to really look for in this is increased irritability, which almost often causes increased fighting in a marriage, change in mood. It needs to be said, change in sex life. And it doesn't mean that a marriage is built on sex, but it is an incredibly important component to a healthy marriage. That's a part of just lack of desire for intimacy. And intimacy doesn't always mean sex, but intimacy means to know and be known. So it can mean sexual intimacy, but also emotional and spiritual intimacy. And for sure, those things have taken a hit. We see that in our office a lot. One of the things that we're seeing is that with this kind of increased fighting and irritability is that in a marriage, they just want to isolate and detach or avoid each other. And again, now's the time to get the support that you need. How, if you want to do that through a church support group of some sort, or come to counseling, but don't let this increase, or don't even actually think, and I tell this to couples, don't think that just when the pandemic goes away that, oh, great, all these marital issues that we've been kind of just immersed in for the last 6 or 7 months are going to go away, because sometimes patterns have been created and kind of ditches have been created. Words have been said to each other that have just caused some real kind of ditch living, so to speak, in a marriage. And so, it's being aware of that. It's knowing that sometimes when marriages get into ditches, both the husband and wife can start to do things to help them feel better temporarily, shopping, alcohol, pornography use, and it's moving into these ditches. And so one of the things, again, I'm going to go back to, can there be some self-awareness in the marriage to say, we need a reset button? I just met with a wife a couple of days ago, and she and her husband are getting away for 3 days. And, they were able to work that out, find place for the kids, and get away and say, we need a reset button. And so some of that getaway, by the way, is going to be, can we talk through how we got into a ditch? And also, can we create fun? So it's just being aware of what happened. So much of this is self-awareness. It's identifying and taking ownership of, here was my part in why our marriage got into a ditch, and don't feel shame in it. Most marriages who struggle being proactive or kind of staying ahead of it, got into these ditches around the pandemic. Not every marriage did, though, and that's the thing, is it's going to take the spirit of humility, a humble heart, to own what's been taking place in the marriage, and then it's a willingness to change. I think those are really important things to look at.
Yeah, that's good, and there's that word humility once again. So let me ask you this question as a follow-up, because I like the idea about the husband and the wife getting together and saying, hey, I think we would both agree that there's a ditch here. Maybe I'm seeing the alcohol abuse or the pornography abuse starting to resurface again. How does a couple know where, hey, this ditch is so deep, I don't know that we can get out of it without some professional help? How do we know when we've reached that point that we might need someone else to speak into it?
So I would say when the patterns are continuing, because all couples have conflict, all couples fight. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think conflict done well actually brings glue into a marriage.
Yeah.
But I would say conflict not done well that is consistent. And again, consistent may mean, certainly it means daily, but a couple of times a week. I mean, that just is saying there's a lot of stress on the marriage right now. And again, I never think it never hurts to go into a counselor. If it's a good counselor that you're going to, it never hurts. So, I think that could just look to say, okay, well, let's humble ourselves and say that we just need a third party to help us. And it doesn't even have to be a trained counselor. I mean, maybe it's just a good, friend that they admire and respect and have some wisdom to say, hey, we're kind of at an impasse here. We've gotten into some patterns that aren't good. Can we just reflect this with you? But it is going to take a heart of humility to say, we are in a hard place and we need some outside help. Or it's just within the marriage saying, maybe we don't need some outside help, but can we carve out some time just for us to sit down and talk through what's happened over the last 6 or 8 months? Can we just reflect? We're not here to blame each other. We just need to look and kind of explain what's been taking place. And so I just think that that's really necessary, and it's nothing to feel shame about. The pandemic has wreaked havoc. And I think that is if I can use this terminology, the enemy has wanted to use this to harm marriages, to harm people, to create anxiety, to cause people to have tons of fear around financial, just consequences. And so it's getting the help you need when you need it, and not keep putting off what's inevitable.
Yeah, that's good. And you mentioned the friend. I really like the idea of a friend too. I think one of the challenges that a lot of people live their lives in front of others like a Christmas letter, meaning when you send out a Christmas letter, it's all the great things that are happening in your family, but there's also a story behind that Christmas letter. And so we need to have those friends, don't we, that maybe know the best about me and the worst about me and the struggles that I have, whether it's personally or in a marriage or in parenting, just to have that friend to go to say, boy, we're struggling right now. We're hitting some bumps in the road here in this during this pandemic. So I really like the idea about a friend that knows those things about you, where my life is not a Christmas letter. My life it's real. The real me and the visible me are the same person when I spend time with you. So I think that's important. Yeah. That's a great observation. Hey, on the other hand, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just gonna say it's huge. I have that in my life. Our counselors have that in their life, and so it's always this conversation of, oh, hey, I was talking to my small group because we've been struggling with this, or like if I say, oh, I've been struggling with I've been struggling with this, and it's just inviting people into that. There's no shame in it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's in fact that's probably a struggle for counselors, because you guys are supposed to always have it together, and your kids are amazing. Your marriages couldn't be any better, and yet that's not the reality for any one of us. All of us have this trials that you're talking about.
Oh, all of us do.
Yeah.
All of us do, and all of us have our own small groups. All of us have our own issues. We just try to veer off before we get into the ditch. And it doesn't mean that we don't get in ditches at times, but we are really proactive in our own self-care and recognizing, I'm very aware of, for our team of 10, I'm very aware of how the pandemic has impacted them, their marriage, their kids. They are very aware of how it's impacted me. It's just living in this place of transparency to say nobody's immune. Yeah. This is a universal issue that's impacted all of us.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, what about the couple on the other side that, hey, as a couple we've been doing this thing really well. We're really cooking here. Marriage seems like it's gone stronger since we started this thing. What would you tell the couple that, hey, how do we get this to continue? Because I really like the togetherness we have, the selflessness that we're seeing, the intimacy that's there. What would you tell that couple that's doing well, but still wants to strengthen their marriage?
Sure. First of all, well done. It makes me believe that, and I do know those marriages are out there, and I have friends who have good, solid marriages and that have had this throughout the pandemic. And I will tell you that there's kind of this common denominator. Those are the marriages that, and I use this example, I can't remember if I used this before, Henry, but, when you're flying on a plane and, they say, hey, if we have a cabin pressure problem, okay, the oxygen mask will drop. And if you are sitting next to someone in need or a child, you still need to put your oxygen mask on first before you help a person in need next to you. And so for marriages that are going strong right now, typically they are the ones that know how to put their oxygen mask on first. They have good boundaries. They have good self-care first, and then their marriage, okay? And they're like, hey, how can I help you? How can I serve you? Because I'm doing well right now. Typically, these marriages have been pursuing good quality time, even in the midst of the pandemic. Typically, these marriages have surrounded themselves with what we just talked about, Henry, life-giving friendships.
Yeah.
These marriages typically can forgive quickly. They don't just kind of push stuff aside and then it just gets kind of toxic, but they keep communication lines open. So this is stuff to keep doing. If they have a strong marriage, they're typically really good listeners of each other. And again, I'm not saying they don't have conflict. I'm saying there's conflict and maybe even fighting, but that these characteristics still hold true for these marriages. They have quality time. They forgive quickly. They make sex a priority, not because marriage is built on sex, but because it's an important element. They often pray together. One of the cool things is I was up in Colorado recently with my parents who are 87 and 80 years old. They pray together every day. And by the way, they didn't always. So it's not like I grew up in a perfect family. I grew up in some tough things about my family. But as they continue to be faithful to each other and inviting God into their marriage, and by the way, they had to go to counseling for their marriage and that kind of stuff. And they're 80 and 87 now, or 86. And, but I observe them praying together. They actually read books together. They're reading a book right now on just encouraging relationships. It's being a servant to each other. So again, what creates a strong marriage? It's saying, hey, you come first before me. I want to come to serve you and not be served, which ultimately then creates a marriage where there's mutual serving. This is an important part to remember, though, about marriage, is that it's often true that both people in the marriage aren't feeling strong at the same time. And I see that with my friends' marriages too, is that, there can be this real ebb and flow where maybe the husband has had a really tough week and he's kind of just done. Okay. And there's nothing wrong with just feeling done. I mean, I was over at a friend's house a couple of days ago for dinner, and it was the husband that was just done. And that's not being critical of him. It's like, yeah, of course. I have days where I feel just done. Like I want this to be over. But the wife was actually in a really encouraging place. And so just know that marriages, it's almost like taking turns, that sometimes one spouse will feel strong and the other one doesn't at all. And when one spouse is feeling strong, they need to step in a little bit more, help with maybe the parenting or the cooking or the schooling as much as that spouse can, but just know that there's going to be a switching off, and that's inevitable. Being mindful of that is just super important. But those are characteristics of a strong marriage that keep them going. Make those things a priority.
Yeah, boy, that really speaks of a servant's heart, though. If you feel like you're the one that, hey, I'm really doing well, very hopeful, work's going good, life's going good, but my spouse is maybe struggling. And what a great opportunity to pour into that person that you love or that family member. I really like that thought, because it's nice when you're both up, but that doesn't happen as much as you might like. But those are great opportunities, I think, to come alongside this person that you love and to walk with them to help them get back on their feet. Yeah, that's really, really good.
I mean, Jesus modeled that. He modeled that perfectly, because he needed his disciples to learn how to model that when Jesus would no longer be around, but would leave the power of the Holy Spirit. But Jesus modeled being a servant. He modeled resiliency in the midst of I'm going to say this in quotes, pandemics. There actually were viruses back in those days and people would get sick, but I'm not saying, it was the same as what we experience now, but I am saying Jesus modeled that. And I think, how do we hang on to that in the midst of some of our most stressful times around the pandemic? I'm not saying it's easy at all, but I am saying it's possible. It's just kind of reordering our life in such a way that we can do it consistently. We won't do it perfectly, but I do think we can do it consistently.
Yeah, that's really good. And even taking that outside the family, all of us probably are aware of people in our lives right now that might be struggling. And it really is life-giving when you can recognize that and then speak into it, whether it's, bringing a meal or writing a note or making a phone call, just reminding them that they're loved and they're cared for, and that you're praying for them. That benefits them for sure, but it also gives life to you as well, knowing that you're coming alongside them. So there's a lot of opportunities in the midst of chaos and trial.
It's really finding purpose.
Yeah.
That's really our, as a believer, to glorify God, but we glorify God by putting kind of words and actions to that, right? And so it's finding, whether it's in a marriage or as a family or as a student, it's how can I find purpose in this? Because God does promise purpose in suffering, and this is a season of suffering for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what about, because it's great if a family member, whether it's a child or a spouse or a friend, that they're honest with you and say, boy, Liz, I'm really struggling. I mean, mentally, my thinking's not good. I've got frustration at work. Emotionally, I feel distraught. If I'm telling you those things, that then you can connect. But what about, how do you help that person, or how do you check in with the person that may not be as transparent, that the real me and the visible me are two different people? Who I'm projecting to you is a guy that, boy, I've got it all together. My marriage is great, parenting's great, work couldn't be any better, but that's not what's happening in my life in reality. So how do you check in to find out how people are doing mentally and emotionally and spiritually?
Sure. So I'll address that in light of kind of peer-to-peer. So, if you're an adult and you're meeting with an adult and you're wanting to check in with them, like, are they really doing okay? Because I know things have been stressful and maybe they've been furloughed and that finances are incredibly tight or whatever that is. The first thing, Henry, is to model yourself being transparent in that. So again, I'm talking about peer-to-peer. I'll address parents to children in a second, but I would say it's modeling that. Like, the longer we fake that we're okay, the longer it's going to take to get out of not being okay. And so, if you're sitting down with somebody or you're Zooming with somebody, Zoom has been the thing, but I do think it's important to get face-to-face, 6 feet face-to-face, but something to just be, I'm using that word incarnate a lot. Like, if we think of Jesus incarnate, he came in the body. And I think as much as we can, while, staying true to what is important to us as far as social distancing and that kind of stuff, if we can be in the body with people as much as we can, with social distancing, it would be helpful. And to then be transparent in that. So again, if it's a good week, this is where, again, we're going to switch places a lot. Like, we're going to have a bad day and then hopefully we'll have a few really good days. Yeah. So I think if somebody's not having a good day, it's just saying that, man, I don't know about you, but this week has been hard and this is why it's been hard. And again, we can't make that person be transparent that we're talking to, but we can at least model it. If we are observing that we don't think that a person that we're spending some time with is doing okay, I think it's important to be courageous and point that out in a very loving way, of, hey, it seems like you're not doing okay. I've kind of noticed that it's harder to get a hold of you, or, hey, you seem kind of down when we're spending some time together. And again, if that person deflects it, says, no, man, I'm doing okay, Henry, there's actually not a lot we can do about that. If we've practiced our own transparency and we were willing to kind of nudge into them a little bit to ask if they're okay, honestly, in our peer-to-peer relationships, that's all that we can do. Let's shift a little bit to kind of parent-child. I'm a fan and try to help parents notice and be mindful of, are my kids behaving differently. When kids are stressed or if they're feeling lonely, kids are typically going to go into one of two places. They might become more needy and clingy, and you want to pay attention to that. Or some kids, and some of this is just personality type, will go into isolating and detaching more from the family. And so you want to pay attention to, okay, what am I observing about my kiddos? And again, this kiddo can be 6 years old or 16 or 18 years old. So I have a friend who has a 16 and an 18-year-old, and they're both in the home, and they're very different. And so one has a kind of tendency to isolate when he's in a funk, and like, I can't see my friends as much as I used to. And then the other one is actually wanting to hang out more in the living room, be around his parents, and that kind of thing. And it's just paying attention to it. I also think it's important to look for opportunities, and it's probably not going to necessarily be, especially all ages of kiddos, sometimes aren't going to be super engaging and want to offer up information. And so it may be that you're doing something with your kid that is a little bit distracting, but you're being very purposeful in asking questions. So again, it may be going for a run together or a walk together, or, again, with masks on, maybe he needs something from Target. And so you go with him and you're just literally with your masks on, you're in the aisle at Target, but you're kind of asking questions that are, again, trying to dig in a little bit without feeling too invasive to the child. Because you're trying to get a feel. I use that word like a barometer, which measures barometric pressure. And we think about pressure. I mean, there's pressure. There's pressure on parents. There's pressure on kids. There's pressure on a lot of people right now. And you want to get an idea of the barometric pressure. And again, you do that with peers. You want to do that with kids. And you want to do that within their personality. Again, if some kids are going to offer you up information, this is kind of a cool thing. So as I told you, I was just doing these kind of pseudo interviews of kids of all ages. And one of the pseudo interviews I did, because I called one of my friends who two of her kids were in the car, and they're actually very, very vocal, and I'm very good friends with them. They feel very safe with me. So I'm on the Bluetooth on the phone. And so I'm asking them, I'm like, hey guys, okay, give me an idea, because you guys are back in school. Give me an idea of what's going on. So these are kids that are very verbal. The parents have just trained these kids up, and they have a really neat family. It doesn't mean this family has been stress-free. They haven't. But, those are the kids that are very comfortable dialoguing with, adults and parents. And they were like, oh gosh, yeah. And they're giving me kind of all this information. If a parent has a kid that's more quiet, closed off, you have to work harder for it, which doesn't mean be pushy, because, if you're too pushy with a teenager or even an 8 or a 10-year-old, they're probably not going to respond well to it. But try to meet them at their level, to look at ways that you can get in to, again, get a barometric read on how are they actually doing.
Yeah, that's so good. The other thing I think is an advantage too, and because you spoke to the person that maybe they're not going to tell you how they're doing, but I really think there's a value in. So if I saw you and I said, hey Liz, you seem kind of down today, if we don't have much of a relationship, you may not give me the answer to that, but you're going to know that I asked the question. And I think there's a lot of value in that, knowing that, hey, there are people that do care about me, that see things, that are asking. And maybe one day, you would give me the privilege of telling me to say, hey, you want to get together, because I'm struggling with some things. And so I would tell folks, hey, if you do see something, always say something, because while they may not tell you, they're going to know that you asked the question. I think there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, there is, Henry. I'm in complete agreement with you on that. And again, and then modeling too, being transparent. But yeah, I think even if you ask a question knowing that you might hit up against the wall, you at least ask. And it is the same between parent and child. You often, as a parent, will hit up against a wall, okay? They don't want to talk, and maybe it's just because they're in a bad mood that day, but tomorrow they'll talk to you. But you can't force that. But it is just paying attention to it. You asked the question, you showed your concern and your interest, and then you just see if perhaps that person will come back around at a later time and just move into that place. I mean, pain is a motivator. And
Yeah.
if people are in a lot of pain, we're hoping that they will reach out and be open to where they are in their pain. But that's both with adults and kids.
Yeah, there really is. I mean, there's a lot of learning that takes place in pain. So, maybe that's going to be fruitful at the end of all of this, where we recognize, hey, what are some things that we learned during this that we did really well, or what are some things we learned that, boy, if we have to do this again, we need to do it differently. So, yeah, a lot of lessons that are there for us in the midst of the pain and challenges.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, what about? So let me touch on this on negative. Having some negative feelings, or is this normal what I'm feeling right now? Do I need to pay attention to this? How do I know that uh, my anxiousness or my anger or feelings of fear or hopelessness, how do I know when I should be concerned as opposed to, hey, I just fell into one of those ditches that Liz talked about, and I need to figure out some ways I can get myself out of this ditch. How do I know when I need to be concerned about these emotions that I'm wrestling with day after day?
Sure. Yeah, great question. First of all, I think all those things you just listed, just anger, anxiety, hopelessness. I'll throw in helplessness because sometimes we can feel powerless, like so helpless in this situation. First of all, I think those are all universal feelings. I would say that if not 100%, I mean 99% of people have kind of ebbed and flowed in and out of those things, especially the longer that the pandemic stayed around. What I would say is that the key word is kind of ebb and flow. Like, sometimes we dip into that feeling, but how quickly do we dip out? Because I'll be honest, I mean, there's times I've dipped into those feelings. And so it's like, okay, wait a minute. First of all, if I dip into a feeling, say I get highly anxious about something, I'm always a fan of reaching out and getting support. So I don't stay in that feeling by myself for very long, okay? But if we dip into it, again, are we dipping into it for a few hours, for a day? If we find that we're struggling with resiliency of getting out of that, and that may be this feeling or these couple of few feelings have stayed with me for a week or 2 weeks, I think that's the time that you need to lean into somebody.
Yeah.
Again, all of us dip in for a shorter period of time, but if we're struggling with resiliency, and that's a really key word, okay? And I don't think people need to feel bad if they're not resilient. I think you and I talked about resiliency a few months ago. Don't feel bad if you're not experiencing resiliency. But I would say that after a week, for sure, if you're going into the second week of having these intense feelings, and again, use a 1 to 10 scale with yourself. If you're sitting at a 1 or a 2 or a 3, that can be manageable. This is a tough season. I mean, we're just struggling here. If those feelings are kind of sitting at a 6, 7, certainly 8, 9, 10, it's time to call somebody. It's time to call your chaplain. It's time to call a dear friend that has some wisdom. It's maybe time to call a counselor.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's knowing when to make that call. Yeah, and I think that's a struggle for folks that we have this, and I don't know if it's because we're not as transparent as we probably ought to be, or maybe I can see you and your family and go, wow, they've got it all together, but I just don't. When in reality, you may be messier than I. In fact, a real quick story. This happened years ago, but this is where I got that thought of a Christmas letter. Got a Christmas letter from one of the missionaries we support, and had 4 daughters. All of them were either graduates of Ivy League schools or at the school currently, and the kids were doing great things. And I read that letter, Liz, and I thought, man, what an amazing family, what an amazing father. And we were maybe facing some struggles during that time. And when he called me a couple weeks after that, and I just said, hey, man, I got to tell you, got your Christmas letter. What an amazing family. Well, you really inspired me or challenged me. And he said these words to me. He said, Henry, stop it. That was a Christmas letter. Let me tell you some things about my family. And after that phone call, I thought, hey, I'm okay. I'm doing okay. And so that transparency to fight to have those relationships where I can truly be the real me, and maybe even people that I have that relationship where they can call me and say, "Hey, Henry, how's the marriage going?" Or, "Hey, that kid that you've got that you're struggling with, how's that relationship?" Or that addiction that you've been
Yep,
wrestling
yep,
with, how you doing with that? I think those are the best relations. Those are the people that will carry your casket one day, because they know me. They know the best about me and the worst about me, and they love me all the same. And so I would just challenge all the
exactly.
folks listening today, boy, fight to find those people that can invest in you like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because again, they love you. I think that the people that can really have that deeper intimacy and friendship, there's more to hang on to, if you ask me, right? So it's the people that do tend to feel a need to put their best foot forward, present well. This hasn't really been hard for me at all. They're harder to connect with,
Yeah.
and it takes courage. It really does. It takes courage. I find that it's usually shame that keeps people from being transparent. The definition of shame is something's wrong with me. And so it can be like, something's wrong with me that I can't be as resilient through this pandemic. Something's wrong with me that my kids are really acting out during the pandemic. Something's wrong with me and that's sometimes the thing that just causes people to go into a shell, and then they end up living isolated. And when we live isolated, we almost always have increased anxiety, depression, just helplessness, hopelessness. The isolation just pushes us more into it.
Yeah. Well, that's so good. Liz, thank you for the time this morning. I knew we would enjoy this conversation, but again, we're so thankful to have a relationship with you. I'm thankful for your wisdom and your willingness to share it with our team this morning. What a blessing you are to all of us. So thank you for spending the time with us today.
Yeah. Hey, I would love to end with a passage from Scripture, Henry, if I could, because it's
Please.
one that I've been reading through that has been so helpful to me just during this crazy time. And it's Matthew 5, and it's the Beatitudes. And I wanted to read it out of the Message, and I wanted to share something. So it was years ago that I was studying this passage, and we throw around the word like blessed or blessing. And we throw it around a lot. And not so much now. People don't want to throw it around, but I think, I hear that word a lot, like, oh gosh, it was such a blessing. I got a new job. And I say that actually intentionally because I know that there's been people that have lost their jobs, and we say, oh my gosh, I feel so blessed right now. I got a new this, or this happened to me. And so I did a little bit of a word study on the word blessed in Scripture. And I ran a commentary that was defining the word blessed, and he was trying to define it most accurately, both using when it was used in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And here's what he came up with. He came up with 3 English words that he says kind of encompasses the word blessed or blessing. And he would say safe, secure, and satisfied. But he went on to define it more succinctly when he says, if you use the word blessed or blessing, really it needs to be said safe in the midst of danger, secure in the midst of uncertainty, satisfied in the midst of want. Wow. And when we think about that in the midst of the Beatitudes, so I'm going to read just the Beatitudes here, and this is out of the Message. And it's when Jesus saw his ministry drawing huge crowds, he climbed a hillside, and those who were apprenticed to him, the committed, climbed with him. And arriving at a quiet place, Jesus sat down and taught his climbing companions. And I just loved that because I was like, we are all climbing right now. And most of us are climbing a hill. So he goes on to say, this is what he said. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be bought. You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink and the best meal you've ever eaten. You're blessed when at the moment of being careful, you find yourselves cared for. You're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. That's when you discover who you really are and your place in God's family. You're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. The persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom. So it sounds like a paradox, Henry, or like an oxymoron to say, wait a minute, if we read back through Matthew 5 and it says, you're blessed when you're at the end of your rope, and we substitute, you're safe, secure, and satisfied. You're safe in the midst of danger. You're secure in the midst of uncertainty. You're satisfied in the midst of want. When you're at the end of your rope, with less of you, there is more of God in his rule. I've been reading that the last couple of months, and I'm like, it may sound like a paradox, which is this contradiction, but actually, if you define that word blessed the way this commentary, William Barclay, defined it, I think it actually fits perfectly and could fill us with hope as we continue to persevere through this season.
Wow, that's really good. So that's from Barclay?
Yeah, that's William Barclay. Now, I'm going to say William Barclay is a little bit liberal in some things, so it's not like I take 100%. I think 70% of what he says is really good, and this is where I got this stuff, and I ran onto the safe, security, and satisfaction years ago, and I thought, that's what we're trying to feel right now. We're trying to feel safe, secure, and satisfied in the midst of uncertainty. And for some of us, we feel like we're at the end of our rope. For some of us, we feel so discontent. Wow. So how can we bring in feelings of safety, security, and satisfaction? And actually, in some way, even though it feels and sounds like a paradox, call it a blessing. And I think God has every intent to move us to this place.
Yeah, that's really good. I love those words. What a thank you for ending that way. That's really good. Hey, if I could top your ending, can I close our time with a word of prayer?
That'd be great.
Yeah. Father, we just want to pause and say thank you. Lord, again, thank you for Liz, for her wisdom, for her work, and for the relationship that we have with her, and given of her time this morning to be with us, to share with our team on how to continue and to do well during this time of trial, this season of adversity. And so I pray, Father, you'd bless her and her team as she continues to help many others. For all of us, Lord, as we finish another work week, I pray that we could look back on this week and be thankful and recognize that we can be blessed in the midst of the trial. So again, thank you for the time this morning. I pray that all of us can benefit from this, that we can not only glean some things for ourselves, but for our families and friends as well. And so we commit this to you now in Jesus' name. Amen.